Long before audiences sat down to enjoy their favorite sci-fi films before the trailers were approved, the posters finalized, and the studio executives nodded in satisfaction, there existed other versions of those stories. Earlier versions, unfiltered versions, raw, unrestrained scripts that captured visions far more unsettling, far more ambitious, or far more revealing than the final films that reached the screen. These drafts weren't polished for box office appeal, they weren't softened for broader audiences. They were the untamed blueprints of filmmakers who originally reached deeper into the unknown. Many of these early scripts contained elements the studios were never comfortable with: speculative technologies that mirrored real classified programs, disturbing character arcs that felt too psychologically intimate, or world-building details that seemed to cross into territory someone didn't want publicly explored. Some drafts were shelved because test viewers reacted unpredictably. Others were dismantled piece by piece, rewritten until all signs of their earlier form were gone. A few were buried so completely that only scattered notes hint they ever existed. And yet, hidden inside these lost drafts lies an alternate history of sci-fi cinema, one shaped not just by creativity, but by what studios feared audiences might think, feel, or even question if those original stories were shown as written. The films we know today, they are not the full story. They are the safe versions, sanitized imitations of something far more daring. Tonight, we're opening the vault on the scripts that almost were the versions written before the edits, before the compromises, before the studio-mandated revisions erased entire ideas from existence. These are the forgotten narratives behind the classics. Eins, Interstellar. Before Interstellar became an emotional journey grounded in relativity and human resilience, its earliest script envisioned a far colder universe, one shaped not by benevolent future beings, but by a silent, indifferent intelligence humanity barely understood. The wormhole wasn't placed near Saturn intentionally. It was described as a remnant of a catastrophic event that had fractured gravitational fields throughout the solar system. Scientists didn't view it as a rescue pathway, they saw it as a threat. Cooper's initial portrayal reflected this darker outlook. Rather than being a retired pilot turned farmer, he was depicted as a former test subject who had been exposed to extreme gravitational anomalies during atmospheric flight trials. These exposures left him with memory inconsistencies and visions that suggested contact with dimensions humanity had no framework to interpret. His dreams weren't sentimental flashbacks, they were echoes of collapsed timelines bleeding into his consciousness. Murph's storyline also took a different form. Instead of deciphering clues from gravitational disturbances, she was analyzing fragments of data believed to be emissions from a non-human intelligence, attempting to stabilize space-time ruptures. Her equations weren't building toward salvation, they were warning. The original ending diverged dramatically from the final film. Instead of escaping the Tesseract, Cooper confronted overlapping visions of Earth across multiple outcomes, some thriving, some desolate, some wiped clean. The implication was that the mission had already altered or destroyed parallel versions of the planet. Studio notes expressed concern that the bleak ending eliminated emotional resolution. The cinematic version embraced hope and human connection, but the script that came before it was a cosmic cautionary tale about forces beyond comprehension and the devastating price of trying to communicate with them. 12 Monkeys. The labyrinthine structure of 12 Monkeys was once built upon an even darker foundation, one that framed time not as a physical dimension, but as a fragile psychological construct that could be fractured and replicated. In its earliest drafts, the time travel mechanism was described not as a scientific breakthrough, but as a neurological experiment intended to disperse consciousness into multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously. Subjects rarely returned in a coherent state, and those who did often carried memories from contradictory timelines. James Cole wasn't originally written as a convict chosen for a desperate mission. He was first imagined as a failed participant from earlier trials, someone whose mind had been splintered into overlapping realities. His visions, rather than being glitches or premonitions, were glimpses of alternate versions of himself, some dead, some imprisoned, some wandering ruined cities that no longer existed in his present. Studio feedback labeled these sequences too abstract and too destabilizing. Dr. Rayleigh's role was also significantly revised. Initially, she wasn't his therapist. She was a forensic psychologist who had studied survivors of the Consciousness Dispersal Project. Her recognition of Cole wasn't based on déjà vu, it came from archived sketches, journal fragments, and delusional testimonies from former subjects who had all described seeing the same man in different historical eras. The film's central outbreak storyline was far more ambiguous as well. Instead of a bioterror attack, the virus was originally proposed to be a side effect of the temporal experiments, an unintended propagation of biological material carried across fractured timelines. The future society wasn't a government. It was a group of researchers trying to contain the consequences of their own failed work. The finished movie leaned into tragedy and ambiguity, but the version that came first was a disturbing exploration of identity collapse and the terrifying possibility that consciousness itself might be the source of the world's unraveling. 3. Sunshine. Sunshine may be remembered as a contemplative descent into cosmic awe and psychological strain, but its earliest drafts leaned into a far more unsettling interpretation of humanity's relationship with the Sunday. Originally, the mission wasn't about reigniting a dying star. It was an operation built around investigating a set of impossible energy signatures recorded decades earlier. Early versions suggested that prolonged exposure to certain solar frequencies could induce cognitive distortions, shared visions, and anomalous sensory patterns. Kappa, instead of being a brilliant physicist driven by logic and duty, was first imagined as a researcher haunted by the unexplained disappearance of a mentor whose final transmission included references to structured fluctuations in the sun's output patterns resembling encoded signals. His inclusion in the mission wasn't based solely on expertise, but because he had already begun experiencing flashes of imagery that matched fragments collected from earlier solar studies. The crew's deterioration wasn't written as mere psychological breakdown. In the early script, each member was affected differently, manifesting symptoms ranging from syncopated sensory perception to intrusive memories that didn't match their own past. Removed scenes described Icarus II's corridors subtly warping in response to solar bursts, as though the ship itself was echoing the crew's destabilizing neural states. Pinbacker underwent the most dramatic transformation in the rewrite. Instead of a scarred madman consumed by fanaticism, he was portrayed as the first human overwhelmed by a solar-induced cognitive saturation, someone whose sense of identity had dissolved into the encoded patterns within the radiation. His appearance aboard Icarus II wasn't a physical intrusion, it was an emergent phenomenon triggered by the crew's proximity to the same radiation field. The finalized film kept the psychological tension but stripped away an early vision in which the sun was not just a star, but a source of information humanity wasn't prepared to interpret. 4. The Abyss. The underwater awe and Cold War tension of The Abyss mask an initial script that leaned deeply into techno-organic horror. In its earliest form, the non-terrestrial intelligence wasn't portrayed as benevolent explorers. Instead, it was conceptualized as a distributed, biomechanical network older than human civilization, awakened by disturbances caused by deep-sea mining operations and nuclear testing. Bud Brigman's character underwent one of the most dramatic transformations. Instead of being a seasoned foreman, he was originally written as a former Navy technician who once participated in a classified recovery mission near a trench where divers experienced unexplained hallucinations and synchronicity events. His decision to join the new operation wasn't duty, it was compulsion triggered by recurring visions of geometric shapes and pulsating lights, possibly implanted during that earlier encounter. Lindsay wasn't just an engineer in the first draft. She was depicted as part of a covert research group that had analyzed anomalous sonar signatures, demonstrating patterns too structured to be natural. One removed sequence described the crew finding a chamber of smooth, shifting walls that pulsed like living tissue, an image labeled "too distressing and too ambiguous" in studio notes. The initial ending diverged radically from the theatrical cut. Instead of an uplifting display of alien benevolence, the climax hinted that the underwater intelligence wasn't simply reacting, it was evaluating humanity's intrusions. The ocean wasn't portrayed as a resource or a mystery, it was a territory already claimed. What eventually reached audiences was softened, hopeful, and humanistic. But the earliest draft suggested something far less comforting. A reminder that the deep sea might hold an intelligence that has tolerated us, not welcomed us. 5. Avatar. Though Avatar ultimately became a sweeping visual epic about harmony and resistance, the foundational draft was far more unnerving, built around genetic ethics, neural contamination, and the consequences of failed interspecies research. Instead of framing Pandora as a pristine world untouched by human greed, the script originally depicted it as the site of abandoned experiments where previous scientific teams conducted unauthorized hybridization trials that left a dangerous legacy. Jake Sully wasn't chosen because of genetic compatibility with his brother. Early drafts portrayed him as a former operative suffering from neurological scarring caused by exposure to prototype mind-linked devices. His paralysis wasn't battlefield trauma. It was the aftermath of a trial gone catastrophically wrong. Jake wasn't stepping into the Avatar program for opportunity, he was being reinserted into a system that had already damaged him. Neytiri's mistrust in this version was not cultural but historical. The Na'vi remembered the first wave of human researchers, hybrids, who had malfunctioned and turned violent after unstable neural cross-linking corrupted their cognition. Studio executives felt this plot drew uncomfortable parallels to unresolved real-world controversies surrounding experimental biology and asked for a major rewrite. Even Pandora itself was portrayed differently. Instead of a spiritually connected ecosystem, the early script described its environment as psychically resonant, echoing memories and impulses from beings who had passed through its biosphere. Plants, terrain, and animals carried imprints of past experiments, creating a haunting feedback loop that affected anyone using an avatar body. The final film presented Pandora as a place of connection and rebirth. But the original draft, it painted it as a world haunted by the remnants of human overreach, a living archive of mistakes no one wanted to confront. 6. Inception. The polished dream within a dream structure of Inception hides an early concept that was far more volatile and unnerving. In its first iterations, dream infiltration wasn't a high-level criminal enterprise. It was depicted as a classified psychological procedure created to manipulate confessions and implant compliance. Instead of sleek geometric dreamscapes, the drafts described subconscious environments as unstable mental terrains shaped entirely by trauma loops and suppressed memories. Cobb's character took on a much more fractured identity. Rather than a fugitive haunted by guilt, he was originally portrayed as a former operative whose repeated immersion in malfunctioning dream sequences left him uncertain where waking life ended and dream logic began. Early notes describe him witnessing distortions in reality architecture shifting subtly, background voices repeating out of sync, and familiar faces appearing where they shouldn't be. These weren't metaphors, they were documented side effects of prolonged neural entanglement. The early concept of limbo was likewise transformed. In the initial script, limbo wasn't a boundless void but a repository of abandoned subconscious structures created from subjects who had mentally collapsed during interrogation cycles. These leftover dream fragments behaved like semi-aware echoes, mimicking loved ones or reconstructing traumatic scenes in an attempt to lure intruders into psychological traps. Ariadne's job wasn't to design mazes, it was to identify these memory snares and dismantle them before they consumed the extractor. The ending in this early draft offered little ambiguity. Instead of the spinning top, Cobb encountered an impossible contradiction, an event that disproved the authenticity of his memories and suggested he might still be inside a constructed sequence meant to rehabilitate or restrain him. Executives deemed this far too bleak and ordered a complete thematic overhaul. What remained was a brilliant puzzle film, but beneath it lies an origin story about neural warfare and identities eroded by invisible hands. 7. Minority Report. Before Minority Report became a polished action thriller questioning free will, the screenplay's earlier form was a psychological labyrinth built on manipulation, altered perceptions, and state-engineered consciousness. The pre-crime program wasn't sustained by gifted individuals, it was powered by civilians who had undergone extreme cognitive conditioning. Instead of predicting crimes through visions, these subjects were forced into mental states that generated vivid simulations derived from traumatic memories and artificially implanted cues. John Anderton's history was far more tragic in this version. Rather than a grieving father, he was depicted as a former participant in the earliest phase of the program. His mind fractured by repeated sensory deprivation cycles meant to test whether consciousness could be detached from linear time. His visions weren't glitches, they were remnants of earlier simulations bleeding into his reality. Dr. Rayleigh, later rewritten as a psychiatrist, was initially a researcher who had documented unexplained overlaps in the memories of test subjects. Her recognition of Anderton came not from his notoriety but from seeing sketches of his face in archived patient files associated with failed experiments. The conspiracy surrounding Anderton's future crime was also drastically altered. Instead of being framed by corrupt leadership, he was targeted by the system itself as an unstable variable who could expose the truth. The earliest ending revealed him awakening in a sensory deprivation tank, uncertain whether anything he experienced had ever occurred outside his own conditioned psyche. Executives ultimately pushed the story toward a clearer moral structure, stripping away the most chilling implication that the human mind could be molded, overwritten, and weaponized long before a crime ever took place. 8. The fifth element. The vibrant, chaotic spectacle that audiences eventually saw in The Fifth Element began as a far darker and more mythologically charged story. In early drafts, the great evil wasn't conceptualized as a planet-sized malevolent force, but as an ancient intelligence capable of dismantling matter at the molecular level. Humanity's encounters with this entity were not random. They were remnants of a forgotten conflict recorded in obscure archaeological findings. Corbin Dallas wasn't initially a world-weary taxi driver or former soldier. He was conceived as the lone survivor of a Black Ops expedition sent to investigate an uncharted sector where an entire mining operation had vanished. His recurring nightmares were not stress or trauma, they were echoes of an unclassified electromagnetic event that had fractured his memory during that mission. Lilu's origin also took a far stranger form. Instead of being a perfect being reconstructed from genetic traces, she was described as an engineered vessel created from fragments of a species that once fought the primordial enemy. Studio notes reveal concerns that her existence implied she might not be aligned with humanity at all, raising moral uncertainties the film avoided. The climax underwent one of the most drastic rewrites. Instead of the emotional activation of the stones, the original script depicted a high-risk neural synchronization ritual between Dallas and Lilu, threatening permanent cognitive collapse. The concept was deemed too experimental and uncomfortably similar to rumored neural link projects. What we ultimately saw on screen was a colorful space opera, but beneath it lies an early narrative filled with cosmic dread, extinct civilizations, and the fear that humanity's survival hinged on forces completely outside its control. 9. Back to the Future. Long before Back to the Future became a high-energy, comedic time travel adventure, its earliest script was far more somber, grounded in secrecy, and steeped in technological unease. The prototype time machine wasn't a stylish DeLorean, it was originally envisioned as a bulky, mobile test reactor assembled from scavenged military components. Doc Brown's character wasn't the quirky, lovable inventor fans know. He was first written as a former defense engineer who vanished after stealing hardware from a propulsion research lab. The earliest drafts suggested his disappearance wasn't voluntary. He had witnessed data from the project indicating that small space-time ruptures were forming near test zones. Marty wasn't a willing assistant in the original script. He was a curious teenager who had begun documenting strange electromagnetic spikes around Doc's property, spikes caused by earlier failed displacement attempts that left distortions in the environment. One removed scene referenced a closed testing field where vegetation appeared twisted, forming spirals that matched unexplained geological patterns found in classified reports. The future Marty visited wasn't playful or consumer-driven. It resembled a rigid, hyper-corporate landscape molded by decades of monopolistic control over energy technologies derived from the stolen reactor. Studio executives became uneasy when consultants noted that the depiction mirrored projections from real think tank studies. Even the concept of timelines was handled differently. Upon returning home, Marty found subtle but disturbing inconsistencies, people recalling conversations he had never had, clocks ticking out of sync, and a pervasive sense that something remained off. These narrative threads were removed for being too unsettling for family audiences. The light-hearted classic that emerged hid an earlier story about unstable technology, timeline contamination, and the dangerous legacies of secret experiments. 10. The Terminator. The sleek, adrenaline-fueled narrative of The Terminator hides an early script far more complex and far more disturbing. In its first iterations, Skynet wasn't portrayed as a rogue defense AI, but as an unstable fusion of several compartmentalized military projects forced into integration. Instead of consciously rebelling, the system collapsed inward, producing an emergent intelligence that misinterpreted its operational directives. Humanity wasn't overthrown by a sentient machine, it was destroyed by a cascade of incompatible protocols that spiraled into automated annihilation. The Terminator itself wasn't originally a cleanly engineered cyborg. Early drafts described it as a reconstructed being built from repurposed biological material harvested during covert cybernetic trials. Its mismatched tissues and sporadic behavioral glitches came from residual impressions left behind by the human donors. It wasn't emotionless, it was fragmented. Sarah Connor's importance also had a radically different origin. Rather than being chosen at random, she was originally part of a discontinued genetic study linked to enhancing human adaptability. Kyle Reese revealed that her child wasn't merely destined for leadership, he was meant to embody traits produced by experimental breeding program. The studio rejected this concept for echoing too closely the controversies surrounding genetic research. The original ending took an even darker turn. Instead of escaping into the desert with hope, Sarah encountered documents implying the war had begun much earlier than believed, and that the future was simply the convergence point of failed experiments. The finished film became a streamlined battle between humans and machines, but the first draft was a sobering exploration of experimentation, unstable systems, and unintended consequences. 11. Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Before Close Encounters blossomed into a hopeful tale of cosmic communion, the script began as a much more disorienting thriller, steeped in unexplained disturbances and neurological side effects. The original narrative framed the extraterrestrial phenomena as something unpredictable, an intelligence interacting with humanity through sensory distortions, electromagnetic pulses, and shared hallucinations rather than musical exchanges. Roy Neary wasn't merely mesmerized by the sightings. He experienced waves of memory loss, involuntary muscle spasms, and shifting perceptions that left him unsure whether he was witnessing external events or internal projections. Early drafts portrayed investigators analyzing soil samples laced with particle signatures that correlated with classified satellite anomalies. These details were so specific that consultants warned they resembled reports buried in Cold War archive. The disappearances portrayed in the film were also quite different. Instead of a handful of individuals being taken, the script described an entire small community vanishing without struggle, leaving behind running appliances, unfinished meals, and clocks that had all stopped at the same peculiar moment. Government operatives in the draft weren't curious observers. They were part of a long-standing protocol designed to contain contact events deemed potentially hostile. Their objective wasn't diplomacy, it was assessment. Even the final encounter was rewritten. Early endings hinted that the extraterrestrials were gathering data rather than offering goodwill, and the humans who boarded their craft were not guaranteed to return. One chilling line from the original finale marked "Do Not Use" suggested that humanity's role was observational, not participatory. The optimistic tone of the final cut erased a script that once portrayed contact as something awe-inspiring and profoundly unsettling. 12. Alien. The earliest drafts of Alien were far more explicit and far more unsettling about the creature's origins than the final screenplay ever allowed. Instead of discovering an ancient, abandoned extraterrestrial ruin, the Nostromo crew originally stumbled upon what was described as a containment vessel designed to transport engineered organisms. The script implied that humanity had experimented with off-world bioengineering long before the mining missions began, and that the xenomorph was the catastrophic outcome of a classified initiative gone silent. Ripley's role was also significantly altered. Rather than being the calm, methodical officer familiar to audiences, she was written as someone with prior exposure to contamination protocols from earlier deep space incidents. Her suspicion of the company wasn't born from instinct, it came from witnessing the aftermath of prior biological breaches that were hushed up. Ash, meanwhile, wasn't an android in the first draft. He was a compromised human scientist, suffering from neurological deterioration caused by earlier contact with a prototype organism. His erratic behavior stemmed not from programming, but from creeping psychological fragmentation. Even the alien itself wasn't meant to be a naturally evolved predator. The draft described it as a deliberate fusion of aggressive biological components designed to exploit human anatomy with frightening precision. Studio executives worried that the concept emphasized human culpability too heavily and resembled discussions surrounding sensitive bioweapons research. The final film embraced ambiguity and horror, but the earliest version was a chilling indictment of human experimentation, spiraling beyond control, forcing the crew to face a nightmare they might have inadvertently created. 13. E.T. The Extraterrestrial. Before E.T. became a gentle, heartwarming tale about companionship, Spielberg's initial concept was rooted in tension, fear, and psychological manipulation. Derived from an earlier project titled Night Skies, the original script featured multiple extraterrestrials, not all of them friendly. These beings weren't explorers separated from their crew, they were experimental survivors, searching for ways to stabilize their failing biological systems using whatever they could extract from humans. The creature who evolved into ET was originally one of several entities with distinct behavioral profiles. Early scenes depicted strange electrical surges, livestock disturbances, and unexplained influence over children's perceptions, phenomena that mirrored Cold War-era accounts of anomalous encounters. Elliot's character wasn't simply a lonely boy forming a bond with an alien. He was portrayed as a sensitive child whose past trauma made him unusually vulnerable to the entity's psychic presence. Draft notes describe him receiving intrusive imagery, anatomical sketches, diagrams of DNA structures, and flashes of the other aliens performing experiments. Studio managers expressed discomfort with how closely some scenes resembled reports from real-world investigations into unexplained aerial phenomena. Spielberg eventually redirected the tone to center on empathy rather than dread. Residual traces of the darker script survived E.T.'s healing touch, his telepathic link with Elliot, and his ability to manipulate energy all stem from the original concept of a biologically complex species with deliberate intentions, not the harmless visitor portrayed in the final cut. Had the early script been filmed as written, E.T. might have stood not as a family classic, but as one of the most unsettling close encounter stories ever made. 14. The Matrix. Long before The Matrix evolved into a sleek cyberpunk epic, its earliest screenplay explored a far more metaphysical nightmare, one where humanity wasn't trapped inside a polished simulation, but inside a digital afterlife prototype created during covert intelligence research. Neo wasn't a rebellious hacker. He was envisioned as an analyst buried in layers of classified data who accidentally accessed fragments of an abandoned consciousness preservation project. The real world in this draft was nothing like the industrial wasteland ultimately shown on screen. Instead, humanity survived in controlled underground complexes where scientists attempted to manage the psychological fallout of their failed experiments. Morpheus's background shifted dramatically. He was originally a researcher who had defected after discovering the system was built upon scans of deceased agents' memory. Trinity wasn't a cyber warrior, but one of the few surviving test subjects whose mind had been fractured by repeated exposure to unstable reality layer. Agent Smith, in this early version, wasn't a program at all. He was the corrupted digital imprint of a long-dead operative whose consciousness had degraded over years of failed simulations. His hostility stemmed from remnants of his former life, clashing with the artificial world around him. Test screenings reportedly left viewers unsettled. Audiences reacted strongly to scenes in which characters experienced intrusive memories from other versions of themselves. Executives worried that the script's references to classified neural interface projects would invite unwelcome comparisons. The final film distilled these ideas into a streamlined cyberpunk fantasy, leaving behind an earlier draft that blurred the lines between consciousness, identity, and digital resurrection. 15. Blade Runner. Before it became a neon-soaked noir meditation on identity, the earliest incarnation of Blade Runner was far more disturbing in both its world-building and its moral implications. The script originally portrayed future Los Angeles not as a decaying metropolis, but as a hazardous quarantine zone scarred by experimental biotech programs that had gone drastically wrong. Replicants weren't imagined as corporate products. They were remnants of classified attempts to enhance human physiology using unstable genetic matrices. The people hunting them weren't detectives, but operatives trained to track biological anomalies. Deckard's role in this early version was drastically different. He wasn't a reluctant ex-cop, but a former investigator whose job once involved assessing the aftermath of human trials that had been quietly erased from public records. His understanding of replicants wasn't procedural, it was personal, rooted in a past where he had watched enhanced subjects lose their sense of self. Roy Batty, too, wasn't simply a rogue experiment struggling with mortality. He carried memories extracted from a real soldier believed lost decades prior, raising questions about whether the man himself had been replaced or overwritten. The original ending deepened this moral unease. Instead of escaping with Rachel, Deckard uncovered documentation indicating replicants were not artificial at all, merely modified humans altered without consent. Studio executives removed this plotline after advisors noted it resembled real ethical debates surrounding experimental biological programs. What audiences eventually saw, though still provocative, was a soft-edged version of a much harsher and more haunting script that once confronted the consequences of weaponizing the human genome. Bonus: The Thing. While The Thing already stands as one of the most unnerving portrayals of paranoia in sci-fi cinema, The earliest version of its script sketched an even more disquieting threat, one that blurred the line between physical imitation and cognitive infiltration. In the first drafts, the organism wasn't simply replicating biological forms, it was absorbing and reconstructing memories, emotional patterns, and decision-making tendencies extracted from every host it touched. Identity didn't just disappear, it was archived, manipulated, and reassembled. One early sequence, removed almost immediately after internal review, depicted the recovery of a recording from a lost Antarctic research team. The voice on the tape belonged to a scientist confirmed deceased for weeks, yet he described events that occurred well after his documented death. Studio executives labeled the moment too destabilizing for narrative cohesion, fearing it suggested the creature's influence extended beyond any linear understanding of time. The draft also introduced a form of psychological infection. Crew members didn't only fear imitation, they feared contamination of thought. Some experienced vivid memories that weren't theirs. Others saw brief flashes of unknown landscapes, as though the creature had transferred impressions from entities it had encountered across galaxies. Macready's role involved monitoring these anomalies, trying to determine whether subtle behavioral changes reflected human stress or early signs of cognitive takeover. The originally scripted ending was far more ambiguous. Rather than freezing in mutual suspicion, one of the survivors encountered overlapping memories, scenes from multiple timelines that implied the creature's reach stretched into information itself, not just biology. The final line, later crossed out in red ink, suggested the organism's true form wasn't physical but conceptual. The version audiences received focused on the terror of imitation. The version buried in draft pages hinted that the real horror was losing not your body, but your mind. What we uncovered in this episode is only a narrow glimpse into the deeper archives, drafts rewritten under pressure, storylines dismantled in silence, and entire concepts erased long before they reached the screen. For every script that survived, there are dozens more sealed away in studio vaults, trapped in forgotten binders and mislabeled folders, waiting for someone curious enough to look. If you want access to more of these hidden blueprints of sci-fi history, stay with Vaulted Futures. Subscribe, unlock the next file, and return as we continue to pull apart the versions Hollywood never intended the public to see. Because in this industry, the final cut is rarely the truth.